It's nice to be here. Okay. Is anybody here? Angela's here.
Yes, there's participants.
Oh, okay. I'll take your word for it.
Thank you. And yeah, Frank, I guess I just wanted to start off by, like I said, welcoming you and also appreciating that you're willing to take a few minutes this afternoon. I guess just let's jump right into it. I think the thing that we wanted to most focus on today was just the fact that you've recently published a book, which is somewhat, I don't know, would you call it an autobiography?
I guess so. I mean, I wrote it initially because I wanted our children, my children, to understand what we were doing. Because when they had a chance to talk about it at anniversary, my daughter said that what she remembered most was all these meetings, because she was 4 or 5, and so she was, pretty close to the floor. And she just remembers all these people coming all the time, and they're always wearing these big boots, and wondered what that was all about. And my son, who was older at the time, living in Lynn, the General Electric Company at that time was a huge presence. Everybody, it's like living in Madison with the university. So if you were the son or daughter of a professor here, and there was some controversy going on, your peers would be discussing, your 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds or whatever. And it's the same in Lynn. And so there was a lot of conflict at GE, and it was in the paper. So the kids were aware that something was going on. And so I thought I would try to capture what that was, why my generation was active. So I wrote it initially to try to describe to them what we were doing.
It's great, and I've really enjoyed reading it. It's interesting, just as a for the brief time where we were active colleagues, I had heard some of these stories at lunch, but nowhere near the amount or depth that are covered in the book. And I'm just curious, when you set out to do this, it sounds like you had a clear goal in mind. How long does it take, or what was the experience like having to sit down and try to write something like this?
Well, I had saved here about 10 or 12 boxes worth of papers over the years, because I didn't think that a lot of them would get saved. Stuff about the union, about the company, about internal left disputes and so forth. And it turns out I was right. And the Wisconsin Historical Society, starting in 1960, began a social action collection. And I had contributed to that in the mid-60s because I was active here in the anti-war movement and a leader of our committee to deal with a referendum on the war and so forth. And so I had saved all this stuff. I put it together once I began to categorize it, because the university said, if you just give it to us, that's great, or the State Historical Society. But the problem is that you can't access it. If you're a scholar and they say, here's a box, good luck. That's one way to do it. And those papers never get used. So I, on my own hook, figured out a cataloging system and cataloged it. Well, that was the hardest part. It took a while. And I hired somebody to work with me on that. Once that's done, you have an outline. But basically, even if it isn't the outline you use when you're writing a book, it is an outline of all the different things that you did in some of the papers you wrote, or the articles or the leaflets or whatever. So at least you've got something sort of organized.
Right.
Well, that took a couple of years. But once that was done, then it doesn't really matter when you start writing. So when I actually started writing, from the time I started writing around April of 2019, I think, I finished it. I finished the third draft on, of all things, January 6th, 2022.
Interesting.
Watching TV, and so that's the first draft, which I don't think was any good. This was about 80,000 words. That was 250,000. That was in June of 2020. 21. And so once I had that done and got people to explain to me how short it really had to be, then have it rejected by a couple of people, even after I'd done a second draft, I realized that they wanted, 80 some odd thousand words. And in my case, that was a significant reduction. Plus, people wanted footnotes. And that's good. I mean, because people can use that as a scholarly book as well. And there's enough direction in there so they can go to the library and go find everything. So that process took about 6 months. Once we had what I thought was a reasonable draft that could be edited, we started that editing process in June of 2020. Finished it up. And then it took another year or so to go through getting it finalized, getting the copy editing done, which obviously still needs to be done, and just making a decision about self-publishing, because it took about 6 months to go to all the various publishers that might be interested, to discover that most of them had a 2-year delay, even if they were interested.
Right.
And I'm 79, or I'm going to be 80, and I said, I'm not interested in waiting another couple of years to see if somebody's going to do something. And even then, for a publication like this, you're responsible basically for selling it. And if they've given you an advance, which most of them wouldn't do anyway, but still paying them. So financially, it didn't seem to make any difference. And in terms of how much work they would do to sell it, didn't seem to make much difference. So I said, okay, we got Amazon and Barnes and Noble to publish it. The self-publishing is print on demand. I don't know, 200 or 300 have been sold so far. And I'm happy with that. I'd like more, clearly, because I think there's something in there.
I think there's a lot in there. And actually, it's funny because you jumped one of my questions, which was going to be, and I know not everyone's familiar with sort of your history, your family's history. And to your point, I was thinking as I read the book, my God, there's enough in here. You could write 2 or 3 books. And it sounds like that's where you started at the first draft level and then had to edit down to get to where you're at.
There is 2 other books in there in this sense. There is a book about the development and dealing with new technology, how workers can deal with it, the choices. First of all, that there are choices, which most people don't automatically believe. And secondly, that a whole discussion of what actually happened. And there are other aspects to that, like you would want to say, where was the most innovative thinking being done about how to apply new technology? Was it coming from the socialist bloc? Was it coming from the social democratic people up there in Sweden? Was it coming from here? So there's a lot of interesting things that can be raised in that aspect. Then there is the whole issue of what happened to the trade union movement in the United States. And where is it now? Where is it likely to go? And I mean, Ibarra and Fletcher talked about that in their book a lot. And Armando and Bill talked about that a lot. And it's a similar book you'd get out of it. The difference is that they approached it much more because they were staff people and activists and thinkers at that level. And I was at a different spot. Although Bill and I, for instance, knew each other in Boston about 30 years ago, 40 years ago now. So there's that. I think there's less interest now than say 20 years ago if I'd written it on the anti-war movement and really what happened there, particularly the what I think is the seminal role of the Black movement. There would not have been an anti-war movement in the United States without the civil rights movement. And in fact, when you look at it, the most clear thinking on the war in Vietnam was done by the leadership of the civil rights movement, particularly Martin Luther King and people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we had close relationships with them. There's some of the strongest chapters we had in our initial anti-war movement in 1965 here, 64, were down south. The most of the subscriptions to the newspaper we printed here initially in 1965 were in Mississippi. So things like that, people probably doesn't immediately, people think about Berkeley or Madison, not about Mound Bayou, Mississippi. And so there's a whole nother history there that might be of interest, but I don't think I'm going to be writing any more books. If somebody asks, I might, but nobody has, and it's a big deal to do that. Besides that, I have to get out of the house and go over to the Historical Society now and dig all that stuff back up again. Hopefully they've categorized it. Or it's probably in that big building now on Dickinson Street. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you're right. I don't think that SNCC gets the credit from that perspective that they probably should get.
Well, it's like this. Who broke the back of McCarthyism? It was the Rosa Parks, when you think about it. What happened up north after 1956? The biggest demonstrations were students in New York City anyway, got out and demonstrated, was in support of the civil rights movement. We were out there, I among many, many others, but people that you've heard of, like Angela Davis and her high school out down there in Manhattan. Everybody was out there, everybody. We were out there picketing Woolworths and picketing this and picketing that in support of the people in Alabama. The free speech movement in Berkeley, which certainly kicked things off in a way, was a movement in support of free speech to raise money for the Congress on Racial Equality. That's what they were arrested for.
Right.
And, that started the whole thing, but that's the kind of thing that really broke the back of McCarthyism. It wasn't, the civil liberties stuff and other things as important as they were. But the political space that was opened up by the civil rights movement and the support for it is what really did it, at least here, and I think other places as well.
Absolutely. No, you're right. It created that space. And I think in a real sense, it got people to understand that they have agency. And if they're willing to do things, they can affect change. And you're right, that ended up continuing to play out in the pivot towards the why are we at war?
I think the other thing that people have said to me, and those are mostly Madison people lately, have said that what came through in the book was that you could do something. They said, so you decided you were going to go try to organize the students here in 1963 and try to get the federal minimum wage. And you didn't ask anybody. You guys just got together with your friends and organized 300 people and went and got it, or tried to get it. And through subterfuge, basically, we got it. But the same was true with the anti-war movement. I think I say in the book, myself, Jerry Rubin, Weinberg, and I were standing in front of the White House in 1965 in August when we had our Congress of Unrepresented Peoples. Now we got within 8 blocks of the House of Representatives before they arrested all of us. So I was sort of interested that in January, thousands of people could invade the place without any big problems until later. But anyway, we got within 8 blocks and all 500 of us or 400 of us were arrested. The night before, or 2 nights before, we're standing in front of the White House, 4 of us watching the pacifists getting arrested. They were in the driveway and the car would come out, they'd sit in the driveway and they'd get hauled off. And somebody said, basically, well, they're very brave and everything, but accomplishing very little in terms of publicity and whatnot. And so I think it was Jerry, but it might have been me or it might have been Jack saying, we ought to take a look at this, what's going on here in this country, and make it so that President Johnson can't speak any place in the United States except at a military base. And 14 months later, that was the case. And it was because he said, well, we're going to do this. We are going to challenge every administration spokesperson that we can in whatever forum we can throughout the country. Now that sounds, 4 people standing there on a hot August night, completely insane. And we thought it made perfect sense. Well, it turned out it did make perfect sense. But we certainly didn't know that, that evening, standing there looking at this and trying to figure out how to bring the voices of people forward.
And again, I think again and again in the book, you give examples throughout your career, your many careers, frankly, in terms of how you've tried to identify an issue, the problem, the root, try to get to the root of it, and figure out what's our best course of action to achieve, an improvement and to achieve the goal, right? Whatever that goal was. Frank, there was another part from the book that I'm just curious about that I don't even know if you recognized a pattern, but it was interesting to me as I read the book that over and over again from various facets, whether it was the retired general or the Catholic priest or even Barbash, at different times in your life where people had basically not done right by you and had done things to thwart your efforts, subsequently, and many times, many years later, would come back to you and basically say, I was wrong. I'm sorry. We shouldn't have done what we did, or I feel regrets for what I did. I'm just wondering about that. I mean, in terms of why do you think that was kept happening to you at different times in your life?
Well, I don't know, kept happening. And I don't think General Icord exactly apologized, although the people in the room at the time were absolutely amazed. I mean, you have to realize that these were the top lobbyists and government spokespeople for Exxon and the defense people. We were having lunch because the defense industry at the time, we're talking about the mid-90s, was the only advocates of American manufacturing, because the Navy Department was saying, if we can't build these ships here, we're in trouble. Right. So they actually had a lobbying organization set up to try to maintain at least the defense aspects of American manufacturing. And my job in Washington at that time was to talk about civilian aspects of manufacturing. So I didn't have anybody to talk to, and so I got invited to lunch. But so they were, I have to say, the rest of the room was even more startled than I was. But as far as Father Monsignor Rice was concerned, I think that's because of he was Catholic, and the Catholics believe in things like absolution and things like that. I mean, you're the expert there, and
it's interesting.
I think that's more. I think that's more in keeping with the culture. And I was surprised, but when it happened, this occurred in the summer of 1966, I think, and I thought that was very moving, and I thought it was even more moving when we got invited to this one of these at the time in the 70s, this sort of traveling institute for humanities, a federal project, where they would have lectures around the country about issues of importance. And Father Rice and I were asked to attend one in Arizona about the labor movement. And there, the two of us went out, and I saw him for breakfast. And I said, what are you going to talk about? He says, well, I don't know, Frank. He says, what are you going to talk about? Maybe we're on in 20 minutes, one of these things. I said, well, I think we should really talk about the 50s and what happened, He says, well, I'm going to make a big surprise, because the AFL-CIO, in spite of his having said something 12 years earlier, was still figuring, it was still the Cold War AFL-CIO, and all the leadership nationally was there, right, with the exception of Lane Kirkland, but everybody else. And I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, we'll work it out. Don't worry. So we get on stage, and he said, I just want to introduce Frank. A lot of you have known him, blah, blah, blah. He says, and everybody knows me. So I want to tell you something. The worst thing we ever did was go after the Reds in the trade union movement. It was just like that. And you could have heard a pin drop. I mean, you can't imagine what happened. And he explained it. Well, why did he do that? It wasn't because of me apologizing, but it was because he saw, as did other people, that there were major changes in the society, and that what they had done was on the wrong side of history, basically. That they had impeded progressive growth of the trade union movement, both in Barbash's case and in Monsignor Rice's case. And they had destroyed an organization that was actually trying to accomplish something. And the consequence of that, 15 or 20 years later, was the destruction of the movement that they believed in, namely the trade union movement. Right. So that's what drove that. And I was just a convenient, sort of lightning rod for that. But but you can apologize. But let's see what happened. In Pittsburgh, it destroyed the United Electrical Workers, and in
Yes.
my case, I don't know whether I've been a good history teacher or not, but I've never been able to teach at all for 25 years in any university, and that was because of what happened here. I mean, nobody is going to get hired as a historian in any university in the United States when they call up the department and say, gee, he's got an interesting thesis here and everything. How'd that work? He said, well, after we got out of court, that's the end of this. That's the end of the discussion.
Right. Starts and ends with after court.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, Frank, I know we've only got a few minutes left, so I kind of wanted to, because a lot of these points that you're making in terms of, and you make them in the book repeatedly around the sort of the absence of a bigger plan, or in general, kind of the erosion of just class consciousness in the United States. I mean, well, today is the start of the World Economic Forum, and of course, Oxfam published their report. I think you probably saw, right, where we're back to the Gilded Age, right? Where, 1% of the population got 2/3 of all economic gains since COVID. And yeah, we're living in times where there's basically, we're back to unprecedented levels of, income inequality. Do you see any echoes in today from sort of the work that you've done over the course of your many careers in terms of, I know there's some mention of your CP involvement in the book, but there's groups, it was in the early 2000s, the Greens, and then it was the Our Revolution, the Sanders folks, and then now more and more you hear more about the DSA. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that everybody is trying. I'm in the DSA and working on some proposals about nationalization of the rail system, and another approach about how we deal with student debt and everything. I'll send you that. But I think what's beginning to happen, at least I hope it's beginning to happen, is that there is a whole generation of young people saying this, whatever we're doing isn't going to work. That the capitalist menu that's in front of us, it doesn't meet our needs. They haven't gotten to the point where there is an explicit socialism is better, or the working class should rule. There was a whole philosophical basis for the left movement in the 19th century and the 20th century that is absent at the moment. People, if you talk to young people, or most people, they say historical materialism, they're wondering whether or not you're talking about the weather or something. And so in that sense, we are, I think the movement in general is at sea. But in the other sense, a sense of personal entitlement, of a feeling that things aren't right, that we can do something, there's been a change there. And I think the most extraordinary thing was this walkout here in Madison and Noodles a couple of months ago. Here, a friend of ours on the bus, right? And she hears these young people talking that they had just left work. Oh, where was that? Noodles. Yeah, we just walked out. What do you mean you just walked out? Store's closed. So we sent somebody over because it was 5 o'clock. We were on the radio, and I said, well, wait, maybe we could find out what happened here. So somebody drives over and the place is closed. And there's a sign on the door saying, need not greed. And talking about the wages. And it turns out it isn't just young people who work. There are 15 people, some people who were working full-time and homeless, other people who were in their 20s with a small family and also broke, and some of the kids. So this 19-year-old woman said, this isn't right. They asked the owners or the managers there to do something. Drop dead was the answer, and said, oh, really? And took off. Well, okay. So, it didn't result in anything lasting. Some of the people were able to get back to work. I don't know where the 19-year-old is. I'm not able to find her. But the fact of the matter is that people did it.
Right.
And once that begins to happen, it becomes, and it begins to continue, and it's continuing. You can see it at all kinds of places now. Once that begins to generate, you have a much deeper looking for answers, like, how did this happen? How come we can't get training? Why is this? What does it mean here that we're never going to be able to get anywhere? Well, that's what's beginning to happen in a different way than individual Marxists or revolutionaries trying to enter some workplace and sort of inoculate it or give it. That's different. In my case, my family was involved in GE since 1905. So the reason I was accepted in part up in the General Electric Company in Wilmington, Massachusetts, in spite of all the red baiting and this, that, and the other thing, is that all the references were to fights within GE in the 1930s and 40s, attacking my father or this or that, but everybody worked at the company.
Right.
My uncles, my grandmother, my grandfather, everybody. You know, it wasn't that in Lynn, it was Schenectady, but it didn't make any difference. It was much, much harder on people who's, were coming in completely from the outside, but it was from the outside. And this is much more a organic development from within, where people are saying, this is just not right. Now, I think if people are coming in from the outside and you have people already thinking about it, then you have some of the same thing that happened in the 1930s, where it only took one spark. And I think my comments about history in there and to the university and on when I have a chance to do it, you have 8,000 people there in Flint, Michigan, more or less, at 1936 when you had the Flint sit down. And 140 people, 140, maybe 150, are the people who sit in the engine place. And I have this interview from Bob Travis, and it's in the State Historical Society. And I said, what were you thinking? He said, we had no idea. He said, we took the building. We knew that was crucial because I couldn't produce anything without the engines, but we didn't know what was going to happen. And in fact, I said, what did people do? He says, the most important thing people did was nothing. People stood there and watched. There were thousands of people surrounding this building, watching to see what would happen, to see what the move was. And when the police attacked the women who were bringing food to the strikers, all of a sudden, the union was it. He said, just like an acid-base reaction, ping, oh my God, they can't attack her. That's my sister-in-law. We're not going to tolerate this. But, that might have worked a different way had the governor sent in the National Guard.
Right.
Because people had been upset before over these things. But he didn't.
Right.
And then that was part of a political thing. But it was people were already saying, this is wrong the way we're being treated. And well, we're at the this is wrong stage, I think, throughout the country in many, many places.
Right.
And so it doesn't take much. People were absolutely astounded with the upheaval 3 years ago. Black Lives Matter. Absolutely. I remember I was stuck in traffic or walking home here on Johnson Street, and the traffic is bumper to bumper. I said, what's going on? And suddenly realized that's because there was a sit-in on East Washington Avenue, right? And people just began to do things. And I think that's where we are. In the absence of a political organization that's capable of organizing, planning, and strategizing, I don't think we're going to be successful. And the progressives are not going to be successful. So we have to do that because we're faced with a centralized, well-financed, media-savvy enemy here who believes in fascism, among many, many other things, and specifically is not interested in governing. And so if we're going to make a move, I think in this country, winning an election by 1% or 2%, 1 or 2%, and not really bringing with us the vast majority of working people who are not ready to support a Trump, but they're not willing to do much else at the moment, isn't going to do it. We have to speak directly to the needs of people. And I think that, the thing I just wrote was about the student hourly help here. That student hourly was not designed, because we helped design it in 1963. It was not designed as a low-wage labor force university. It was designed as a way that people could earn enough in 10 hours a week to get your tuition paid for.
Right.
The answer right now is $64.20 an hour if you're going to work 10 weeks to pay your tuition as a work study. I don't think the university is offering $64.20. Maybe it's $74.20, but I don't think they're doing it. But unless we say to people, progressive people say to people, here's the story, everybody. You want to go to school? You shouldn't bankrupt yourself for life. If this society can't provide it, we need another one. And I think that's what people are going to have to begin to do. And the left, the political left, is going to have to be able to speak in a language that everybody understands. That's a pretty clear language. Want to go to school? You shouldn't go bankrupt. You know, these people are in your way. They got to get pushed out of the way. That's clear. Well, we'll see if we can do that.
Well, it's always interesting and a pleasure to speak with you, Frank. Again, very grateful you were willing to jump on with us today. Folks, I don't see any questions in the chat. I know we're at time, and we really appreciate you attending. If you did have a burning question, feel free to enter it in the chat, and we'll hang out for a minute or two. But otherwise, thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you next month. Thank you.
Thank you. What do you want me to do? Wait?